Yeah.
We should just get started. Thanks for coming back relatively quickly from your break. So earlier this morning we had something starting from really micro kind of behavior, individual preferences, and we're going to move to as far out a scope as possible. We're looking at the global financial system. Right now it's a great pleasure to introduce and welcome Jose Antonio Ocampo. Almost all of you heard of him, or some of you know him. Jose Antonio is a distinguished economist and professor of practice at Columbia University. He was the ex-finance minister of Colombia and the Under Secretary General of UN DESA, so he has a very wide body of experience in macroeconomic policy and in development policy in general. And so if you haven't yet had the chance to speak to him during this workshop, please try to make sure that you do meet with him with respect to your interests after it. And he will speak on reforming the international monetary non-system, as he calls it. So welcome, Jose Antonio.
Thank you. Yesterday I told Akbar maybe I should have chosen another topic, but this is the really macro. But it's actually the topic which I have done most research in recent years, together actually with the issues of Latin America, which I just published a book. So let me try to see what are the issues here. First of all, the title is not wrong. I said non-system because we don't have a system. I mean, that's precisely. So perhaps in the international financial system, you could also talk about this, the non-system. But actually, the international financial system has been organized by the private sector. And you can actually say there is a system. But in the international monetary area, we actually don't have a system. We used to have a system, which is the one created by Bretton Woods that collapsed in the early 1970s. I'll go through that. We don't have a system now. Now, now, what do I mean by the international monetary system or non-system? As you know, well, we used to have the gold standard, which was abandoned in a sense in two stages. First of all, effectively it died, let's say, with the First World War, when major European powers, including the UK, which was, let's say, the mother of the gold standard, abandoned the gold standard. It tried to be reestablished and it finally collapsed in 1931. Or rather, you can say in two stages. 1931, when Britain abandoned the gold standard, and the US, which abandoned the convertibility of dollars per dollar and the value the dollar in 1933, 1934. Okay. So after that, essentially, but there had been a trend in the late 19th century. We essentially had a collection of national fiduciary systems, right? So each country has its own paper money, let's say not convertible into any into gold or silver like it used to be. So you have a fiduciary systems in many countries. So when we talk about the international monetary system, we're talking about how those monetary systems relate to each other. So first of all, what international means of payments and store of value is used out of those currencies. Basically, the US dollar with the euro, etc. We'll go through that. And then how you move between systems, which means the exchange rates, okay? The mobility of capital between different monetary systems, and how you support illiquidity in one of those parts of the system. So that's essentially what we're talking about. I will go through that. So this is a different issue, and perhaps I should start with that. So you can say when we talk about the global monetary and financial system, we're going to talk about two different objectives. So when you talk about a stricter financial system, you are talking about financial regulation, how you regulate finance. I mean, you have global rules of regulation and possibly supervision of major financial agents. The same. These are also largely national systems. I'm not going to talk about that. Okay. I'm talking about the strict monetary system, which is, interestingly was a preoccupation before the international financial system, and for one basic reason: the international financial system essentially disappeared with the Great Depression. There had been an important international financial system, but with the collapse of the Great Depression and the defaults on the massive scale that took place internationally, the international, there were very few things that continued working in the financial system, essentially trade finance, the private sector. Then there was public sector finance by the Export-Import banks, starting with the U.S. Export-Import Bank, and the World Bank, et cetera, et cetera. So there was something that was rebuilt gradually, but it's only in the 1960s that you can see the mid-1960s with the euro-dollar market, that you can see the beginnings of a new international financial system. So the major preoccupation with the international financial system only started in the early 1970s when the Basel Agreement was signed to try to have common regulatory standards. But that's again, that's not part of my lecture really. So my lecture is actually about other thing that was a center of preoccupation and the negotiations at the end of the Second World War, and part of the major reconstruction of the international architecture after the Second World War, which is the international monetary system. So how these monetary systems relate to each other. And this is the issue, of course, is macroeconomic stability at the global.
Can everyone at the back here? Okay, do you want? Yeah.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Okay. So the Bretton Woods arrangement, 1944. How did it deal with these issues? So the first one is you put at the center of the system, and that's what is called the global reserve system. You put at the center of the system the dollar convertible into gold for central banks. Okay? It was not convertible into gold for everyone because actually the U.S. had abandoned convertibility with citizens, with U.S. citizens in 1933. It has never, so in a sense the U.S. Continued to be on the gold standard, but only vis-a-vis other countries. Okay. So that's the center of the system, the gold exchange standard. Second, it was agreed that the exchange rates would be fixed as a principle, but could be adjusted, the parities, vis-a-vis the dollar, okay, which was at the center of the system. It was an interesting option because it implied that flexible exchange rates were not seen as optimal. And that was because of the experience of the 1930s. The 1930s were generally perceived to have generated chaos in the international monetary system with a lot of flexibility, a lot of competitive devaluations that had taken place and that were not convenient for the system. So the idea was, you have fixed, as a moment you will have a fixed exchange rate, but you could adjust it. So adjust it so it was not returning to the gold standard. Only dollars were convertible, but would have a fixed exchange rate vis-a-vis gold. All the other currencies of the world would adjust their parities. Okay. Second, so the exchange, that's the one dimension of the relation between currencies. The other dimension, which is capital flows, the principle was capital flows could be controlled. So the principle is the asset flows of capital across countries were subject to regulation by countries. I mean, countries could decide to have free capital flows, but that was the national choice. Okay? and this, by the way, is still in the Articles of Agreement of the IMF. There was an attempt in 1997 to eliminate, to include the principle. I mean, the IMF Articles of Agreement, to be precise, establish what is called the current account convertibility. That's for trade purposes. Countries have, in principle, a commitment to convert their dollars, their national currency into dollars or other international currency, but not for capital flows. Okay, so in the jargon of the IMF, there was the attempt to include capital or capital account convertibility into the IMF Articles of Agreement in 1987 in the Hong Kong annual meetings, and the promoters of that idea failed. So today, still, we have that principle in the IMF Articles of Agreement. Countries are free to regulate capital flows, okay, altogether. The fourth component of that is you have, for countries in the liquid position, you have the possibility of financing on a limited scale. So the IMF, this is a total, it was a total innovation, so you have a sort of emergency financing by the IMF to countries. That was totally new. But it was limited, and certainly much more limited than John Maynard Keynes, one of the architects of the system, wanted. And the reason why it was supposed to be, it was so limited, in a sense, was because you were, the IMF was supposed to finance current account deficit, not capital account deficit, okay? So there were limited amounts. And itself, how did the IMF finance itself? Well, it financed itself basically through quotas, okay? Initially through quotas, so the countries made a contribution to the IMF, to the quota. Most of the money, I mean, they did a contribution in principle in their national currencies. But most of the national currencies were not convertible. So most are essentially useless. It's estimated that maybe 70% of quotas are useless for the purpose of lending. Or 60% the same. But the developing countries were forced to give a contribution, part of the quota in gold. I mean, all countries in gold actually with one percentage, and an additional proportion in convertible currencies. Okay? So the developing countries do bit in gold now, no more additions they set to that gold quota. Then you have the other part in convertible currencies, and then in your own currency. But then your own currency, let's say the pesos of the world that are in the hands of the IMF are just accounts. They are useless for that. So I think this is important for the reason that I'm going to show. Later there was this idea of what is called the arrangements to borrow, which essentially developed countries could give bilateral credit lines to the IMF. Okay? When the IMF needed more money, let's say. So it had to be in convertible currencies. Okay? Now that has been expanded significantly during this crisis, and many emerging economies are actually contributing to that, except that the arrangements to borrow, the formal mechanism is collapsed altogether for one very funny reason, is that the US is not part of the countries that are contributing to that. And finally, and very importantly, there was the idea that the IMF will be some sort of coordination of international monetary policies. And that implied, first of all, the principle that every country had to be subject to surveillance by the IMF on these national policies, what are called the Article 4 consultations. So the Article 4 of the Articles of Agreement give the IMF the power to surveil countries. And then the principle that international monetary decisions will be taken in the IMF. Okay. This The surveillance has been practiced systematically. It had been effective for many in emerging and developing countries. It has been totally ineffective vis-a-vis the powerful countries. And this is one of the subject of discussions during the recent crisis. And as we will see, there is essentially no macroeconomic policy coordination through the IMF. Now, this system collapsed in several stages, starting in 1971, when President Nixon first devalued the dollar vis-a-vis gold and then abandoned convertibility. So what is we inherited, what is this non-system that evolved out of that? I mean, we said Bretton Woods was a system, you know, good or bad in many elements. What we had after that was essentially an ad hoc arrangement. There was actually an attempt to negotiate a different system that took place in the IMF between 1972 and 1974 in something called the Committee of 20. But that effort failed altogether. I mean, it only led to very minor exchange. So as a result, what happened was more the result of events that took place rather than of a design of any other alternative system. So the first thing is that the gold not being convertible into gold, the currency at the center of the system became a fiduciary currency. So you can say that we evolved from the dollar gold exchange standard to a fiduciary dollar standard. So the center of the system is a fiduciary currency. Okay? Now it can be other currencies can compete. So it's a free for all in a sense, except that not all can compete in that. So that we'll see that the only other currency that really has a significant share is the euro. But for instance, China is very interested in having its currency be part of that game. We'll see how, so far, it has not gone very far. Second, countries were free to choose their exchange rates regime. So they could have fixed exchange rates, floating exchange rates, or whatever they want. So exactly speaking, the exchange rate has no system. The only principle that was agreed in the mid-1970s and was ratified in 2007 is that you should not manipulate your currency. Okay. The third is, although as I pointed out, the capital flows can still be regulated by any country because that element of the Articles of Agreement was kept. The principle, excuse me, the practice became otherwise, so that there was increasing liberalization of capital flows in the world. Okay, so the capital flows have been effectively, liberalized to a large extent. Other countries continue to have the capacity to regulate. Official balance of payment financing was significantly expanded in different stages, but essentially with each crisis there was an expansion in the facilities because it became clear, starting with the Latin American debt crisis of 1982, but also with the Asian crisis of 1997, and then more recently with before 1997, very importantly, the 1994 Mexican crisis, it's called tequila crisis, and then 1997, and of course 2007, 2008, that most of the balance of payment problems of countries are associated today with capital flows. So you have to, the amounts of emergency financing that you need when you have a capital account crisis is much larger than you need for current account crisis. And for that reason, the facilities, let's say, or the credit facilities of the IMF have been significantly revamped. To allow each crisis more or less generates a totally new scheme to finance countries in difficulties, which have different characteristics. I'll come back to this issue, what has been done with the recent crisis. And then the other element of the system is that surveillance is essentially ineffective for major countries. It is partly effective for countries that have that are weaker, let's say, players in the international arena, but have no IMF program, and they're very effective for countries that have IMF programs. Okay, that's essentially. But essentially, surveillance has not played a role. There has been an attempt with this crisis to stronger surveillance. But there is, I mean, if you are interested in this issue, there is a fantastic report by the Dependent Evaluation Office of the IMF that was published last 2011, called the IMF in the run-up to the crisis, which shows how ineffective surveillance was vis-a-vis the major countries, how they were totally incapable of identifying financial problems in the US and the UK in particular, and how the UK and US the Article 4 consultations have been totally useless. So it's interesting, very interesting issue, and this is very important because one of the big issues today is stronger surveillance. And then whatever macroeconomic consultation was done outside the IMF. There was an attempt, as we will see, to do it in the IMF, but effectively it's done by the G7 and now by the G20. So outside that, in a system that I call elite multilateralism. Okay. So in the system, as it exists, the dollar remains the dominant currency. Let's say here, 1998, it was 70% of global reserves. It's a larger proportion of trade transactions. The only other currency that competes is the euro. So through time, there has been a gradual reduction in the role of the dollar. I'll show in the next graph that is basically vis-a-vis the euro. And very interestingly, the euro has not lost any attraction during the euro crisis. And the other currencies, here you have the yen, which is much less important today than 10 years ago. The British pound, which is totally relevant yesterday and today. And other currencies in which you see a slight increase at the end, which is the renminbi, okay? But still, very minor. So it's a system basically based on the dollar and secondarily on the euro. And actually, most of the changes in the composition are associated to the euro-dollar exchange rate. Okay? So here you have in red you have the euro-dollar exchange rate and the share of dollars in reserves in blue. So you can see here it fell from 72% in, let's say, in 1999 to like 62%. But the basic reason was this big shift here associated to the appreciation of the euro. I just for fun estimated a basket of €1 and $3, let's say, and estimated how it has changed through time in value, and basically predicts this. So like 80% of the change in global reserves is associated with that exchange rate. It's not that the countries are shifting the reserves, it's basically the euro has appreciated over the long term. And in macroeconomic coordination, what I call is, what happens is this thing that I call elite multilateralism. So the dominant countries take for themselves the task of doing whatever coordination they find interesting. And this is what, so they don't generally use the IMF. In fact, you can let me come here, okay? This is not nothing new, let's say. The major issue in the early post-war period was the scarcity of dollars worldwide, okay? Which was in the language of the times, it was called the dollar shortage, okay? And of course, particularly for Europe, during this reconstruction. So it became very clear early on that the European countries could not rely on the IMF because of its limited financing to be able to manage the dollar shortage. So how it was solved? Well, it was solved through Marshall Plan. So the Marshall Plan provided the dollar liquidity to Europe, which was very important in the European reconstruction. For example, even the intra-European payments system through the European Payments Union was done with Marshall aid. Okay? So the reconstruction of the convertibility of European currencies in the current account, which took a bit more than 10 years, was done through Marshall aid, with Marshall aid. So the Marshall Plan, a bilateral agreement between US and Western Europe, was the major framework for international payments in the early post-war period. Then the next step is the collapse, the collapse of the Bretton Woods. How is it managed? In an ad hoc manner. So the G10 at the time met together and led to this Smithsonian Agreement of December 1971, which was basically agreement to move into a flexible exchange rate system, okay, among the major currencies. It was also an agreement to negotiate a new international monetary system, which is the attempt that was done between 1972 and 1974 and failed. Then the next step is the yen problem. The yen problem, and how is it managed? It's managed through it's the yen-dollar problem, strictly speaking, because it's you can say the first is the European problem. The second is the dollar problem. This is the dollar-yen problem.
Everybody will be familiar with what the yen problem is.
No, I'm going to explain. The problem was the significant. I mean, there was a huge appreciation of the U.S. dollar vis-a-vis, and a huge deficit vis-a-vis Japan that built up in the early 1980s. Okay? This is associated to monetary decisions in the U.S. and not going to that. So the big issue was how to appreciate the yen vis-a-vis the dollar. I mean, that's a huge issue, and it was done essentially through two agreements, which are called the Plaza Accord of 1985 and the Blue Accord of 1987. This, by the way, is very important historically because the Chinese had learned then that this was not the way to go. I mean, it was clear that for many that the huge appreciation of the yen became a major source of the financial crisis of Japan that happened around 1990, right? So that the speculation in yen-denominated assets, say, in Japan, was an effect of these accords. And that's why the Chinese are very clear that they will never be forced into something like this. Okay? And then the other system that is very important before the most recent agreements, to which I'm going to later on, was the agreement of Europe, that they will not move into flexible exchange rates among themselves. So the Europeans have always clarity that, and this is by the way, this is a fundamental problem of this non-system that we have today, that you want to have deep trade integration, you may not want to have flexible exchange rates. Okay? This is what the Europeans have always have clear in their minds. So they said, well, we want deep integration, but you cannot have flexible exchange rates. Why? Because you can have changes in competitiveness between countries, in a very short period of time through exchange rates that that could, totally change trade flows. This is an issue that, by the way, that has come back during the recent crisis very strongly. And of course, on the one hand, in the discussions in the U.S. on whether China is manipulating its currency, but also Brazil. Brazil, has brought to the WTO the issue that, manipulation of currencies generates trade distortions. Okay? So it's really a major issue. And I mean, this is, actually it's also true for individual countries. I mean, I said that this is sort of a schizophrenia in Orthodox, contemporary Orthodox thinking, because, on the one hand, you want to have, export-oriented economies, very open export-oriented economies. And then you tell, well, actually that's what Bretton Woods was about, because Bretton Woods was also a major objective in the WTO agreement, as you can see, the first article of agreement, was to reconstruct international trade. And it was perceived at the time that the flexible exchange rate system of the 1930s was not the way to go, because it had generated a lot of competitive devaluations. Okay? So the best system was actually a system of fixed exchange rates. So the Europeans after 1971 decided that they wanted to keep some a system of fixed exchange rate among themselves. Okay? Among themselves, in order to continue doing deeper trade integration. And that was the agreement. It has several stages. The first one is what it was called the snake. The snake was this system in which the European currencies will have limited flexibility among themselves, but they will float together vis-a-vis the dollar and the yen. That was called the snake. Okay? So you have a system in which you mix a sort of new Bretton Woods agreement of fixed exchange rate among European currencies with the flexible exchange rate work that was taking place. That moved then into the European monetary system, and it moved into the euro. The decision was taken in December 1991, although it was finally launched in 1999. And it's very clear what is I think for me it's quite clear what was the basic reason. The Europeans actually kept capital controls until relatively late. They only decided in 1990 to liberalize capital flows among themselves as part of the construction of the European unique market. And why did they refrain from capital account liberalization? Basically because of the same issue that they wanted to have fixed exchange rates. So they thought that the system of totally liberalized capital flows will generate instability of the exchange rates, which will affect trade among themselves. So they decided to refrain from capital account liberalization for a long time. Until they decided in 1999 that building one market meant also one financial market, so they had to have liberalized capital flows. 2 years later, they had a big crisis. It's called the European monetary crisis of 1992. So it's one of the many cases in which you liberalize capital flows, and soon later you have an financial crisis. The decision, so they had, in a sense, two decisions: to go back and restrict capital flows, or to decide to move into a new system. And that's why actually they decided the second, the latter, and they decided to move into the euro. To say, well, this is only compatible with having one currency. And then with all the problems that I don't have time to go into. Okay? So for the Europeans never wanted among themselves to have flexible exchanges. That's the reason. Okay? And for the reason that they thought that was inconsistent with deep trade integration. So they resolved this schizophrenia in a very particular way. Okay, so you say, well, what do we do with this non-system? So So let me see different ways we can say. Let me say, I said that there are at least 5 things that you could, you could move forward. And you could do it in partial way, so it's not. And what is striking is how little of this is in the international agenda today. Okay? It has been mentioned in several things, several places. Actually, if I may say, the commission that Professor Stiglitz headed in 2009 for the UN General Assembly, which I was a member, is probably the most important attempt to propose a different system, which is very much along these lines, although with some caveats, I would say. Okay, so you want a new international monetary system, or you can say a new international reserve system, in which, I'll come back to this, you want to perhaps to move into the broader use, I will not say the total use, but the broader use of a truly global currency. So instead of having the dollar, since we have fiduciary currencies today, you want to move into a global fiduciary currency at the center of the system. Okay? Now, the only global fiduciary currency that we have was the result of the discussions in the 1960s, and it has this very awkward name, let's say, of the special drawing rights of the International Monetary Fund. I'll come back to the special drawing rights, the SDRs, and they're generally called. Okay? So the special drawing rights is a true global money, fiduciary money. So it's money issued by the IMF for all member states. So now, in practice, the system of the future, if you go in that direction, is unlikely to have that currency being used worldwide. I mean, it's not a money that you will use, let's say you will have in your pockets to pay, when you travel, or even firms or even banks will not use. Okay, so you'll have a big system, and getting to that, in which you'll have that system at the center as a sort, I think, of, you can say, a money of central banks. So it's a money, fiduciary currency, but it's only used for payments among central banks. But it's used as a store of value backed by the whole membership of the IMF. You can have other systems. For example, I mean, Professor Stiglitz in making globalization work proposed a global reserve bank. But that is not possible. I mean, creating a new institution is not possible. So I think the best we can do is build on this thing that has already been created. Okay? Mixed with the use of dollars and euros and renminbi and rupees and reals, whatever other currency you can think of. So it's a system, mixed system of a true global reserve currency at the center. By the way, in the beginning of the negotiations of 1970 to 1974, that's what the British proposed, to have the SDRs at the center of the system. So to fully move into that, I think the creators or the idea of this global currency, of course, the big ideologue of that idea was John Maynard Keynes. But in the 1960s, it was Professor Robert Griffin, who I'll come back to. And the idea is that the world has been moving since the late 19th century into the dominance of fiduciary currencies. So the next step is for the world monetary system to move into a global fiduciary currency. But that's, maybe that's 100 years in the future, but in the short term, we can have a mixed system, and would you use that global currency together with national currency. The second is to have a better system to coordinate major economies. Okay? So the macroeconomic policies of major economies, so that they don't, the major economies do generate the spillovers, effects. I mean, the most important is that has been subject to a lot of criticism, again, led by the Brazilians, is that the very expansionary monetary policy of the U.S., which is at the center of the current system, has implied a huge export of capital to emerging economies, which are pressuring their exchange rates and generating problems. The currency wars is the term that the Brazilian finance minister gave to that. So the idea that you have to coordinate somehow so that you don't generate those spillovers. Now, what is true at the global level may also be true at the regional level. It is true that the monetary policies of Brazil are unlikely to have global effects, right? But they do have significant effects for Argentina, okay? And the Argentinian policies have significant effects for Brazil. So maybe, and I guess the same thing is probably true in this part of the world or in East Asia. Actually, in East Asia is quite well recognized that you can generate significant spillovers, and they have moved into a system of some form of surveillance at the regional level. So you may want to do that. And of course, one of the major spillovers is the exchange rate. Okay? And that's why you may want to have some surveillance or even some limited flexibility of exchange rates, which is something that has been widely spoken. Then you have to have more regulation of domestic and international finance, which includes, very importantly, cross-border finance. It's one of the very funny characteristics that when the G20 launched the Financial Stability Board to coordinate financial regulation, it left entirely out of the agenda cross-border finance. Almost as if cross-border finance was not finance. Okay? Okay, so that the issue of cross-border finance was taken over by the IMF because it is a major responsibility of the IMF and led to some conclusion. Then you need larger emergency financing during crisis. And finally, you probably want, but this is probably not in my agenda today, an international debt workout mechanism. So you need a bankruptcy regime for countries. Okay? Now this issue is back in the agenda because of Argentina, because of the decisions of the U.S. judge that would make the rescheduling of restructuring of the Argentinian debt. Anyway, the U.S. judge decided that the creditor that did not sign the agreement with Argentina have the same rights as the ones who signed. There's a big mess going on. It will decide it, I think, early March.
How does the U.S. judge get to make international decisions?
What?
How does the U.S. judge get to make decisions?
Well, because one funny reason. All legal contracts have to be registered under some legal system. So most debt contracts are registered under the U.S. law or the British law or the Luxembourg law. And this one, the rescheduling of Argentina debt and the bond issues associated with them was done in the U.S. By the way, this has major implications for the U.S. If this goes through, the U.S. will never be used again. New York will never be used again for any rescheduling of debts. They will be done in Britain, they will be done in Luxembourg or somewhere else. Maybe in Hong Kong. I don't know. But the system will, actually this has major implications for New York as a financial system. Because the U.S. system will, people who are associated with this tell me that one of the great advantages of the UK and the US as financial centers is because of the whole tradition of being flexible in decision. And that this inflexibility that associated to the US decision may actually mean essentially that London will take over from the New York totally of this issue of debt rescheduling. Okay. But again, I'm not going to talk. So let me talk about the other elements. My view is that under any system, we have to have the IMF at the center because, of course, this requires major changes in the governance of the IMF. I'll come back to those. Okay? But we cannot create, I mean, another institution. I mean, the world will not create another institution. So the best I think we can use the IMF. And I actually prefer to use the IMF to use the G20. Because the G20 is first of all, it's not a formal treaty-based organization, let's say. And second, because it doesn't have everyone in. Okay? So it's elite multilateralism. So I prefer multilateralism over elite multilateralism. Let's say, and even if the multilateralism is deficient, let's say. But it's better than that. Now, the story of when the IMF has been used is interesting by itself, and how it has been used. Okay, so you say the best precedent is the SDRs. So, and this is a very interesting story. The story of replacing the dollar at the center of the system was a European idea, and particularly a French idea. The French hated in the early post-war the fact that the US dollar was at the center of the system. They wanted to be part of it. So they proposed a system in the early 1960s that would create a new global currency, but that currency was essentially backed by 5 countries, including, of course, France. So it's the US and 4 European countries. And very interestingly, the US decided to bring the debate to the IMF. Why? Because it thought the backing of developing countries was useful for that discussion. And that's why the SDRs were discussed and designed within the IMF, contrary to the French. And that's why initially France did not want to join the SDRs. And well, that had major repercussions in institutional terms. And that's why they are called, they have that funny name of special drawing rights. Drawing in particular, because in the IMF terminology, you can draw on your quota. Okay? You can draw, you can use it during crisis. Okay? So this was the same idea. They're drawn, which means in a sense that the SDRs are a loan rather than an asset. Okay? In fact, they are both very funny. They are both assets and liabilities. It's a very funny monetary instrument because of the opposition of France to create a full-fledged asset. Okay, like money is an asset, right? So, but the French were opposed to that because they quite like the system that it would be, and that's why it was designed as a parallel system, which has many restrictions. The most important restriction of it is that the SDRs cannot be used to finance the IMF, okay? Which is the obvious way to go, as I'll go back to this, okay? So the SDRs were discussed and adopted by the IMF, and in 2006, the IMF launched a very interesting process, which was called the multilateral surveillance of global imbalances, which was a mechanism that I like. It was only 5 participating countries or regions, because with the US, the UK, Japan, China, and the European, and the Euro, the Euro area, participating in a system to coordinate the reduction of global imbalances. So it was a limited membership, but within a multilateral organization. Okay? So it had the virtues of being limited, which is what is said the advantage of the G7 and the G20, having the relevant actors sitting down, but at the same time it was responsible to the whole membership of the IMF. So you can think of mechanisms like that. I think is what is better than you're designing a totally alien system outside the IMF. Now, since 2009, you have 2 things. On the one hand, the G20 creates this mechanism of macroeconomic policy coordination, which is called the mutual assessment process, or MAP. Okay, it's a mechanism by which countries present their macroeconomic packages, and then it's judged whether they are consistent with each other, the same, whether they are not going in different directions, okay? Or generating negative spillover for other countries. That exercise actually is done by the IMF. So the IMF, and it's very funny when you read the documents of the IMF, is done as a technical assistance. Because formally, you have taken the macroeconomic policy coordination, which is a basic function of the IMF, to the G20. So the IMF can only do technical assistance in that particular program. Now, I think this is a major deficiency of the system, and it would be much better if the whole thing was brought to the IMF, which effectively is done by the IMF. Okay? But the other has been a revival of the IMF in many ways, but I will in particular mention this is strengthening surveillance. So the idea that has come out of the crisis is that one of the major problems that the world has is that it has no effective surveillance. And it has no effective, and it had no multilateral surveillance, let's say. So the idea has been that you have to have a stronger surveillance of individual countries, and particularly of the major countries, and at the same time, see the consistency of the policy. So there has been a myriad of new ideas, and I think the most important thing that has happened in the IMF in recent years, and the future of the IMF, is in surveillance, and to the extent that it has some effectiveness in its surveillance process in terms of pushing major countries in different directions, which is something that we have to see yet. But I think that's the most important. And there's also a lot of changes in the facilities, but again, indeed multilateralism is, through the G20, is what continues to be there. Now, let's see the different parts of this, what it implies in terms of the different elements that I showed in the beginning. So the first one is the global reserve system. So this dollar, or you can say dollar-euro international monetary system that we have today. It's essentially dollar, okay? With the secondary role for the euro. See, there are three problems that are known historically, and one additional problem that we have seen at least in two times, and it's very important today, as we will see. The first one is what I call the anti-Keynesian bias of the system, which relates to the one basic observation of Keynes when he analyzed the international monetary system, the gold standard in particular, by his proposals for a new system that he wrote during the Second World War, is that the monetary system has a bias against deficit countries. So deficit countries must adjust, surplus countries do not have to adjust. And that generates a recessionary effect. If countries that have to, the deficit countries have to adjust, they have to reduce aggregate demand, surplus countries don't have to expand aggregate demand, and the net result is that worldwide we have a reduction in aggregate demand. So that's the first problem of the system. The second problem is what the problem that was identified by Robert Triffin, this great thinker of the international monetary system in the 1960s, and which came to be known as the Triffin dilemma. And it relates to the role of national currencies as a global currency, that is, to the dollar. Okay? So his point is, under the dollar-based system, international liquidity has to be provided by the US. Okay? How does the US provide liquidity? International liquidity by having deficits, right? You have to have a deficit so that the other countries have a surplus and get that additional liquidity. Right? That's how the system operates. Now, he said, but it just happened that the fact that the country at the center of the system has to have deficits implies that that trust in that currency may erode through time. So you have a system that the US has to create liquidity, but at the same time, reliance on the dollar will weaken through time. Confidence in the dollar at the center of the system. Now, that was reflected in 1960s in a very concrete way. It was reflected in the fact that the gold reserves of the U.S. Were depleted significantly by the decisions of other countries to convert their dollar holdings into gold, which eventually led to President Nixon's decision to eliminate that element of the system. Right? So the U.S. said, well, we cannot continue losing gold reserves. Okay, and the U.S. had something like 80% of global gold reserves at the end of the Second World War. Had by the 1970s something like 1/3 of global gold reserves. So it's a significant problem. That was the problem of the 1960s. That problem is not here anymore. And what happens is basically you have cyclical loss in confidence in the dollar. So what you have is essentially you have an unstable dollar. So it goes through cycles of confidence in the US dollar, which implies that the currency at the center of the system is unstable. Okay. So that's the second problem that we're thinking about. The third is what I call the global inequities of the system. Why this is emerging economies learn through their own crisis that the only way to protect themselves was to accumulate reserves. Right? So we were very vulnerable to crisis because we don't issue international currency, let's say, or currency that are trusted as convertible currencies. And therefore, when crisis comes, there's a significant outflow of capital. And for that reason, the only protection that we can have is to have more reserves. Now, so the system, now, what are reserves? Reserves are essentially US Treasury bonds, right? So the system creates a very funny a transfer of resources from developing countries to the US. So all our central banks accumulate reserves and then transfer that money to the US, which is the center of the system. Okay? So we are doing a reverse transfer of resources to the US, and that's global inequities. The poorer countries are transferring into the richest country of the world part of the resources. And the fourth problem, which is we see is back here again, is the basic problem of recycling of surpluses, particularly of oil exporting countries. Today also some mineral exporting countries, which is a major problem. It has been a major problem. I mean, you can say the Latin American debt crisis was the result of the inefficient recycling of petrodollars. We're going through that process again as we will. So let me show you graphically each of these problems. So the best way to show this asymmetric burden of adjustment is to look at the Eurozone. So here you have in the bottom all the peripheral costs. So you have here, start here with Ireland, then you have Spain, Portugal, and Greece. Okay?
You put France as a peripheral
What?
country. France is in the peripheral countries according to...
Well, we have here France and Italy in the middle, okay? But these are the peripheral countries which have had massive adjustment. So from 2007, 2008 to the present, so Ireland now has a small surplus. Spain actually is balanced this year, and huge reductions in the deficits of Portugal and Greece. So all the deficit countries have had to adjust. Okay? A massive adjustment, 6% to 8% of GDP. So these are, emerging country standards, let's say, of adjustment. Okay? Now look at here. These are the two major surplus countries of Europe. This is the Netherlands, which instead of reducing its surplus, is actually increasing its surplus, and Germany, which has only marginally reduced its surplus. Actually, the German surplus now is the largest of the world. It's above China. Okay? And then you have in the center France and Italy, which have essentially, actually Italy becomes an adjusting country most recently. So you have a system, again, in which deficit countries have to adjust, surplus don't have to adjust, and the net result is recession. Okay? So that's the anti-Keynesian bias of the system. So this happens also at the global level. So the East Asian crisis, which was a worldwide emerging country crisis, essentially all emerging economies adjusted. And in that particular case, there was not this problem. For what reason? Basically because the US adjusted in the opposite direction, as we will see. Okay? Yeah, this is exactly what I have here. Okay? So this is the US. So here we have, this is the current account balance of the US in blue, and the real exchange rate of the US dollar in red. And I draw here in the opposite direction to what is usually centered. This is I don't know, probably in India, but in Latin America, we always use the exchange rate in the opposite because in the American way, that's why I always have problems with this. The exchange rate falls. No, in fact, in our tradition, the exchange rate rises. When you depreciate the currency, your exchange rate increases, right? You have more rupees per dollar. So this is the same. So this is, I draw, and the basic advantage of that is that it goes in the same direction as the current account. So that's why in textbooks, actually, this is the way the real exchange rate is used. Anyway, what you have here is two things. First of all, a clear pattern in which the US, under the fiduciary dollar standard, has become more responsible. So less in the gold exchange standard, the US could not run too high deficits because it would lose gold. On the current system, it doesn't lose gold, so it can run deficit because basically it finances deficit by issuing dollars, which are then used internationally. So that's one thing. But the second is the cycling confidence in the US dollar. Okay? So you have here the appreciation of the dollar, the rising current account deficit of the US, which generate the glass and blue reports and lead to the depreciation of the dollar and the reduction in the US deficit. So you have a first period of cycle in the value of the dollar. Then you have a second cycle here in the US dollar here, which is particularly true actually as a result of the Asian crisis, the Asian, Russian, Latin American debt crisis of the late 1990s. Now, in this case, the problem that we saw before was not present. And why it was not present? Because essentially the US absorbed so the deficits. So you have to have some country that increases deficits at the other side when the emerging economies were creating surpluses, right? Because of the crisis. And so the US did. But that was done at the cost of another appreciation of the US dollar, okay? Which became a major problem in recent years because of high levels of the deficit that the US reached around 2005, 2006. So we are in the opposite phase now. So you can say that this shows that the three-fin dilemma has two concrete manifestations. The first one is that you can say there is no discipline for the US in the system, but the second is that the currency at the center of the system is unstable. Okay. So that's the two dimensions.
One clarificatory question.
Yes.
How is this real exchange rate of US measured vis-a-vis euro?
No, vis-a-vis what the IMF measures, so vis-a-vis all currencies. So also, I mean, probably not all currencies, but all major currencies, so that because they are weighted by the share that each country has in the trade. Like I say, so there will be a small proportion for India, a larger proportion for China also here, and not only the euro, okay? or the British pound or the yen. This is the story of reserves, okay? So essentially, forget about this, which are the oil export of the Gulf countries. So until the 1980s, the reserves as a proportion of GDP were essentially very similar worldwide. around 3% of GDP. So the reserves were, very small proportion. You see, as a result of the Latin American debt crisis, so in the early 1990s, but particularly of the Asian crisis, we see this huge jump in reserves. So developing countries and emerging economies learn that the only way they can protect them is by doing this. So you have, first of all, you don't want to go to the IMF to start with, okay? But if you go to the IMF, the financing that was available was limited. So the only way you can protect yourself is by having a war chest, right? And that's what.
What happened with the Gulf countries?
In the Gulf countries,
2004.
well, you have the boom. The Gulf countries have the oil price. I'll come back to the Gulf countries in the next slide, actually. But you can see here that actually start with the, well, of course, you can start with China. China is here red, and it's actually measured here. So China has went from having, as you can see here, very similar proportion to the rest of the world to having 50% of GDP in reserves. Okay? But take the middle-income countries, excluding China. Okay, now we have in the left-hand scale, but you have about, go from 3% to 20% of GDP in research. But low-income countries, they also go from 2%, 3% to about 10%. So every one in developing countries, the oil, the Gulf countries essentially follow the cycle of oil prices. So when oil prices collapse, they were very high into the mid-1980s, so they were accumulating reserves, then oil prices fall and they use the reserves, and then the new jump in oil prices is reflected in a huge accumulation of reserves. Actually, more started today because the oil companies also learned that they cannot spend all the surplus. That's what they learned in the 1970s and early 1980s, and that's why they had a huge crisis since the mid-1980s. And this is a mix of several of the previous problems, which is quite interesting. These are the imbalances, the current account imbalances of currencies. So as in previous graph here, you have the U.S. in the bottom. So the U.S. is the large deficit country of the world. Of course, deficits have declined as a result of the global financial crisis that are increasing again. But look at the other countries. So look at the surplus countries. Okay? So the major surplus countries is not, as a group, is the oil exporting countries. Okay? And they're by far the most important. So the most important global transfer now is from the oil exporting countries to the U.S. Okay? Now, China actually became a major surplus country, but is declining as a surplus country. East Asia is actually stable. And look at those other emerging, which is actually a very interesting story. Other emerging includes India, South America, etc., okay? What happens here is that, as a result of the Asian crisis, so even limited deficit led, to the crisis, there was a correction. So all the countries moved into a surplus position as a group. But look what has happened as a result of the crisis. They have moved into massive, deficit, which is very interesting. So the system now is operating so if you have surpluses, you must have deficits, right? And the problem is who has these deficits? Because the deficits are the problem. You have to finance them. And they are the source of potential vulnerabilities. Now, in the past, the emerging economies, but also the U.S., have learned, or some European peripheral countries, that they cannot run deficit. They have to run surplus because of the first problem of the system. But then somebody has to run deficits. Now, it just happens today that Europe is increasingly generating surpluses. The U.S. has reduced its surplus. The oil countries are increasing their surpluses. So who the hell is absorbing the benefit? Well, China, which has reduced its surplus, and the other emerging economies. So the whole adjustment now is actually on the emerging economies, the non-oil emerging economies. Yes.
So, what's happening in Russia?
Include here as an oil exporting country. Which is, that's what Russia is today. It's a Saudi Arabia. Very similar to Saudi Arabia. There is a larger, a bit more diversified, but not too much. I hope there is no journalist. Okay? Yeah. Okay, so what can you do? So my idea is that you can actually do a couple, a mix of two things, really. In fact, I used to think that we could move into this SDR-based system, but I don't think this is viable, politically or economically, actually. Politically, because the U.S. will never accept that. Okay? So you have to move into a system that in which the U.S. has something to gain. So the multi-currency standard will be a system in which you have more global currencies. Now, that system does not seem to be evolving automatically. I mean, you can say the euro, as we saw in our slides, has gotten that place, let's say, as a secondary global currency. And has been able to sustain that during the crisis, which is quite remarkable. But the system, I mean, and then of course the Chinese are trying to put their, they are the policy of internationalization, the renminbi, which have been only partly successful. And it will not be successful for some time because in order to have a global currency, you have to have convertibility of that currency. I mean, countries, who want to use that currency should be able to move in and out of that currency. And second, for that, you have to have a domestic financial system in which you can go and make the exchange. So you have to have an open capital account. And now, the Chinese don't want to have that today. And I think they're right, actually. Actually, interestingly, the Japanese move out the policy for internationalization of the yen. The Japanese are very clear that they don't want the yen to be an international currency. Okay? Now, the Chinese are moving in the opposite direction, but I think they don't have it. Japan does have the capacity to have an international currency, or a secondary international currency, or a third tier, let's say, but not China today. So essentially, you can have a system that has several advantages and deficiencies. It particularly provides diversification, but it has certain instabilities associated to that. I mean, eventually, and this is an issue that has been discussed repeatedly for the dollar, countries may want to move out of the dollar. So you have to have some way of managing the instability that generates. Okay? That's why since the 1970s there have been the idea that you have to have an account in the IMF where countries can change their currency, their dollar holdings for something else, which would be SDRs, okay? As a way to manage the instabilities of the system. So the other is an SDR-based system. I said, I would think today, and this would maybe complementary because I actually think the only alternative, the only way to go that has any possibility is to have a mixed system. Which will have still the global currencies as being a major, all trade transactions are done in those national currencies or regional currencies in the case of the euro. And we probably have in the future regional blocks in different currencies. But you have at the end the SDR at the center of the system in what way? First of all, and very importantly, you start to use the IMF more consistently as a source of financing of countries in difficulties on a larger scale. So in a sense, you move the IMF into something closer to a global reserve bank in the Stiglitz terminology. And how do you do that? The first thing that you have to do is use the SDRs for that purpose. So today, as I said, due to the discussion in the 1960s, and particularly the French opposition to the SDRs accounts are a sort of parallel accounts in the IMF. And they cannot be used to finance the IMF. And now, how do central banks operate during crisis? They essentially issue currencies, right? The national currency. And how do they issue the national currency? They lend, right? So they lend to the private sector, or they lend to the governments indirectly by buying government bonds, right? That's how, so you create liquidity, national currency are created by central banks lending, right? Well, the same thing should be true for the IMF. So you essentially issue SDRs the same way central banks do. Okay? So and that means that all the IMF lending is done in SDRs. So you eliminate that duality, you eliminate national currencies altogether from the IMF, and you start using a system based on SDRs in the IMF. So the SDRs will have two purposes. There will be a reserve asset, hopefully with increasing share as a reserve asset in the world. Second, they will be used to finance IMF programs, which has the capacity that you don't have to use national currencies. You just do it as central banks do. You create money by lending to countries. Right? Now, how could the system operate? My very simple proposal is let's treat, so you issue SDRs, and if countries don't use their SDRs, so they don't sell their SDRs, those SDRs are considered a deposit in the IMF, and those deposits in the IMF can be used to lend. Okay? So you move fully the SDRs into IMF accounts, and you make them, so that system will have many advantages. First of all, the issue of global currency will be proportional to the IMF quotas, let's say. I'll come back to that issue. And particularly, you will be able to manage international liquidity, particularly during crisis, by managing the issuance of that international currency. Okay? So you do with the IMF more what the you could, have development dimensions here. Let me see. In the 1960s, well, actually, 1960s, when the creation of SDRs or similar thing was being discussed, there was a lot of discussion about how to use that for development purposes, particularly to finance aid. The discussion came back in 1970 to 1975 during these negotiations. It failed altogether. But you can do some simple thing. For example, you can make a criteria in SDR allocations that the demand for reserves is important. Okay? Which means that since the countries that demand reserves are emerging and developing countries, you should have a larger issuance of SDRs for them. Okay, so you include the criteria, an additional criteria for SDRs, different to the one that you have for quotas. That was one. All the other one is what is called a development link in SDR allocation, which is something that we propose in the Stiglitz report. Is that with these deposits of SDRs, the IMF could buy, for example, bonds of the multilateral development banks, bonds of the World Bank and other banks, and those will be used for lending. My time is running very short, so this is I'll move into the governance part because I just finished with this to see how SDR allocations are very concentrated in high-income countries actually because of the quota system, okay, of the IMF. So you see these are the three basic allocations of SDRs in history. The one that was done after the SDRs were created, there was every crisis there is an allocation of SDRs. Okay. This is the 79-81 allocation. There was another one in 1997, but it was not approved by US Congress. So it became effective in 2009, okay? Which, when there was the G20 agreed to this large issuance of SDRs, $250 billion, okay? And you see the allocation, the high-income OECD countries are following, but they still represent 63% of the allocation of SDRs. But the big increase has been in high-income non-OECD, basically the Gulf countries, and China. Okay. So the middle-income countries, excluding China, have had a very small increase in time, and low-income countries have actually a reduction in their share. So you really have to think about an allocation system that is more favorable to development. So with that, let me shift to the governance system. Okay. These are on the other issues, the stability of the dollar, etc., etc. Okay. So what are my ideas on this? My ideas on this is that you probably want a system that that has different elements. Okay. So the first one is reforming the Bretton Woods institution, the quota for the Bretton Woods institution, so that it reflects more the share of emerging economies in the world today. That's the first thing. It's a process that is going on, as we will see, but it still has a long way to go. Okay? The second is that you want to have a representative organization at the apex of the system. And as I pointed out, I prefer to have the IMF, macroeconomic issues, at the center of the system, because at least, with all its deficiencies, it represents all the countries of the world. But if you don't want, you want to have a broader, a sort of global G20, I prefer to go into a different organization as I will go to. Third, and very importantly, I want what I call a dense system, or you can say a dense multi-layer architecture. So what do I have here in mind? I have in mind exactly what happens in the multilateral development bank system. So in the multilateral development bank system, you have the World Bank, you have regional development banks, and you have sub-regional development banks, and even one interregional bank, which is the Islamic Development Bank. So you have an architecture that has many institutions and cover, now that architecture is very good for smaller and middle-sized countries. Why? Because you have access to alternatives. And so I want the international monetary system to evolve in that direction, okay? Now, the innovations here have been very limited. The most important is the Shanghai Initiative of East Asia. In Latin America, we have a little one, which was Latin American Reserve Fund, which has 7 members. But I want that, and the Arab world has the Arab Monetary Fund, which is more a trade financing institution, but has moved into more monetary functions. But I want that to be multiplied worldwide. So that I have been writing this, this is a prediction for the next 4 years, okay? But I see the international monetary system of the future should be a network of reserve funds, not one global institution. Okay? So I think that system is much more balanced in terms of the participation of middle-sized countries and small countries, but it's also more stable, because you can respond to regional needs as well as to global needs. So I think, now where are the two forces of reform? Let me just point, is rising powers. I mean, this will happen if the rising powers are on board on this idea. So otherwise this will not happen. And the rising powers are on this idea of reforming the Bretton Woods institutions. They are not quite in the right okay? So let me basically go over the first one, the quotas and voting power. These are the basic problem here is our representation of Europe on the representation of Asia. say, sometimes it's said of the emerging countries. No, it's Asia. Latin America is well represented. I mean, according to its quotas, I mean, some countries are overrepresented, some are underrepresented, but you know, overall Latin America is okay. You know, Africa is okay. Should probably have a larger quota for other reasons, or rather larger voting power. I'll come back to this. And also it's more electric, which is something that it has already been. And there are other issues. I'll come back. I mean, the issue of quotas and voting power is important, okay? Because the voting power has two elements in the IMF, as well as the World Bank, actually. One part is the quota, and the other part is what is called a basic vote, which is equal for countries. So, in a sense, you can say the UN followed the system of one country, one vote. The IMF generally, or the World Bank generally follow the principle of $1, one vote. But in fact, this element of the basic quota, which was very important at the beginning, something like 20% voting power, but then declined significantly, you know, is the one country, one vote element of the in the voting system. Okay. This is very important because if you increase that, you give particularly to low-income countries the only way to increase the voting power. And it has been, as we will see, rapidly effective. The other reform that has been discussed is the 85% majority rule. The 85% majority rule for certain decisions, or the most important decisions, let's say, in the IMF implies that the US has veto power. Now, very interestingly, the BRICS have been the obstacle to reforming that. Not necessarily the US, I mean the US also the same. Why? Because the BRICS as a collection of countries have the 15%. So they don't want to stand down. So they are not for this reform. There have been reform idea that they should be reduced to 70–75%, so that the major decisions don't require necessarily the US vote. This is very important. For example, as I said, in the case of the 1997 issuance of SDRs, it was blocked by the US for a long time. The second point is the competitive merit-based election of the IMF and managing direction of the World Bank president. This, as we have seen in the last 2 years, is not true. It was not true in the IMF, it was not true in the World Bank. And so this has a future. I made my little investment by being a candidate to the World Bank, investment in the change of the system. And this is a more complex issue. It's very funny that in these institutions, the power is not in the ministerial bodies, but in the IMF is really in the board, and in the World Bank is in the president. So you want to have, that's a very undemocratic system, okay? Because you want international organizations to have the ministers have a stronger voice, let's say, in the decisions, okay? So you have to have a governance reform that also gives to the governments perhaps a stronger voice. Particularly, I think that I find the World Bank system in which governments are actually more or less irrelevant to the World Bank. I mean, the World Bank president really is the decision-making power.
We should close up in the next 2–3 minutes.
Yeah.
Do you want to continue here, or do you want to take some
No, let me just
questions?
two slides.
Yeah.
Two slides. This is the reform that was done in the last 5 years. So this is the change of quotas. So the major thing is that what I call the European G10 lost 4% quota that was won by developing countries, but it was highly concentrated in a few countries, in China, and what I call the other winners, which were Korea, India, Brazil, Mexico, Turkey. And very interestingly, the rest of the developing countries lost, including the low-income countries. But because of this, the change in the basic quotas, the increase in the share of basic quotas, actually, for developing countries, the situation was much better in terms of voting power. Okay? So this country that lost a lot in terms of quotas only lost 1.4%. And the loss of voting power of the Europeans was much larger. But of course, this still has to go quite a bit.
So, questions, and I'm sure there are a few. We could take them over lunch, because you all have your group meetings and so on immediately after that. So, thank you, Jose Antonio, and please asking questions around lunch and so on.
Yeah.